You wouldn't think something as humble as bread would have so much folklore attached to it. Yet many of us encountered bread-based superstitions when we're young. I'm sure we've all heard the old wives' tale that eating your bread crusts would make your hair curly. My primary school had a particularly draconic dinner lady whose desire to foist her own opinions onto children seemingly knew no ends, and she felt it entirely appropriate to try and force my brother to eat his crusts. That said, given his own curly hair, he wasn't entirely sure why he should be eating crusts at all. I managed to avoid such nonsense by taking bread rolls in my packed lunch. But bread stretches far back beyond the halcyon days of the 1980s, providing good luck, success in baking, success in love, and even medicinal remedies. So let's investigate the folklore of bread in Britain in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. For a tiny second there, I almost forgot how I introduce episodes, and then I realised that Beth in Erie, Essex would never forgive me if I didn't start with, well, hello there, which she does actually have as a text tone, because I thought that would be funny. Anyway, welcome to the podcast, and also welcome to a whole new month, as in March 2023, and this month we're going to be having a look at the folklore of food. Clearly not all food, because it's only a month, but I am going to be picking out types of food that seem to have an awful lot of folklore associated with them, or in other words, some kind of cool, interesting story linked with a particular type of food, which I'll get to that in that particular week. But anyway, we're starting off with bread, because while it might seem like a bit of a boring topic almost, it is one of our oldest foodstuffs, and there's a surprising amount of folklore associated with it. It's something that we all got obsessed with during the first lockdown. Well, I say I didn't, because I've tried breaking bread before and my efforts are shameful. Like, I just cannot manage the whole kneading and not having all the dough stick to you and all that kind of nonsense. No, I'm going to stick to cake, thanks. So, I'm not a bread maker at all. But no, some people are. And there was a lot of people who suddenly got into making bread during the pandemic. So, there's that. And I think that's where it's quite interesting to sort of almost see bread kind of run like this through line through people's lives, whether it's gluten-free or not, obviously, because that's another option. And it's just something that I think we've all encountered bread of some description, and it sort of seems to provide this general background radiation of our lives. So, without any much more of an introduction, because let's be honest, it's bread. I don't have to really explain what it is or where it comes from. We're just going to jump straight into the folklore. So we're going to start off with the look things. And if you heard the folklore of clothing episodes in February, my God, there was a lot of stuff associated with whether something was going to bring you good or bad luck. Bread, a little bit less so. So the things that bread will bring you are a bit more specific. But there are 3 things to do with bread and luck. So one is a 19th century Scottish belief, and this saw bread held in such high esteem that actually destroying it would invite want into your life. And on a similar track, people believed that throwing crumbs into the fire fed the devil and therefore invited bad luck. And if a servant left her job and she'd done particularly well in the position, her mistress would hopefully give her some bread as she left. And if she kept part of it, good luck would be hers as long as she had it. And also, cutting the top of the loaf before the bottom meant that you'd rise in the world, hence upper crust, which I thought was quite interesting. Now, you did have to be careful how you handled bread before you baked it. And for one thing, you do need to make like that cross mark across the top. And that's actually like an actual baking thing, and it's all to do with like the way that it rises and stuff. But you had to be careful that you made that particular mark with a skewer, not a fork. And as the saying went, she that pricks bread with fork or knife will never be happy maid or wife. Now, marking the cross on top of a loaf, as I say, is a design feature, not a religious advert. But surprisingly, in 1252, a mandate of Henry III actually forbade bakers to mark loaves with the sign of the cross. I have no idea how those loaves would have risen, or if they found another way to get around that problem, but they probably did. But in 1813, the tendency of northerners to make cross marks on their loaves with a knife before baking was considered a remain of popery, which just seems quite fascinating. And by 1908, this was actually considered a way to keep the devil out of your bread. At least I'm assuming it's out of your bread. It just says keep the devil out. It doesn't specify what you're keeping the devil out of. But in Yorkshire, people made a cross with their finger, and it was called crossing the witches out. And if you forgot to do it, servants were convinced that the bread would stick in the oven or otherwise just not bake properly. Now, if you did forget to do the cross and throw, it wouldn't bake properly. So they weren't exactly wrong in thinking that. It's just the reason for why it wouldn't work was possibly slightly different. And indeed, in Northern England, people would place the loaves in front of the fire, obviously to help them rise in the warmth before they baked them, and they would add crosses on them at that point to stop the devil from sitting on them. And I don't know about you, but I have this really weird sort of mental image of the devil sort of just skipping around. Oh, Tahee, look, people have got their loaves out, I'll go and sit on them, and taking great delight in just plonking himself down on some loaves in front of the fire. And I don't really think that that's necessarily the mental image that anyone was going for, but that's where it leads. But speaking of the devil and bread, there is quite an interesting legend from Dartmoor, and this is actually part of the tradition of stories that explain sort of geological formations through the devil's actions. And you get quite a lot of these which explain why a rock looks a particular way, or why there's a stone in a particular place, and so on. And in this particular case, there's a rock formation on a hill on Sowerton Common known as Branscombe's Loaf. And according to legend, Walter Branscombe was Bishop of Exeter in the late 13th century. Now, his diocese covered a huge swathe of Devon and Cornwall, and he used to like to get out and about to go and see people. Now, one day, he and his chaplain were traversing the diocese, but somehow they got off the road between Oakhampton and Tavistock. They got thoroughly turned around, and this mist descended, and they were like, oh dear, how are we going to find the path again? Now, eventually, while they were trying to find the path, they actually grew so hungry that they could barely continue, and the bishop announced pretty much to all and sundry that he would give anything for a bite to eat. Always a slightly dodgy thing to say things like that, particularly where folklore is concerned, because lo and behold, a stranger emerged from the mist. And this old man held out some bread and cheese, and his skeletal face was no doubt ignored in the desperation to eat. Now, the bishop had almost accepted the proffered food when the chaplain stopped him, because he'd spotted the stranger's cloven hooves. The devil cried out in anger and dropped the bread and cheese, where they became the Branscombe's Loaf formation, and you can still see them to this day. I'm assuming they changed size, otherwise that would be a really, really small formation. But it's a cool story, and as I say, lots of the stories do involve the devil sort of throwing a rock or a stone, usually in Paddy, because he hasn't gotten his own way, and then thus they become this particular natural feature. And I like that one because it related to our theme. But obviously, where we've then got the devil offering bread to people, bread also had a protective side. And if you fed your horse holy bread and holy water, no one would steal it. And this one was actually recorded in 1499, apparently advised by a witch in Suffolk. Other people said that putting a holy crust of bread under the pillow would ward off hags and improve sleep for children. And if you needed to carry a baby out of the house at night, then you would put a piece of bread in its bib to protect it from evil. Now, by the 16th century, bread had become a healing item, and you said only the paternoster over it, made a cross over it, and then laid it on whatever ached. Apparently, it was quite efficacious for toothache if you did this particular remedy. And indeed, people actually believed that bread that was baked on Good Friday had a whole range of curative properties and would never turn mouldy. Now, I am going to do a special episode on hot cross buns, and I don't want to dwell on this too much, but it is related to bread as well, so I thought I'd just put this little snippet in here. But while the bread did turn hard, various anecdotes do relate the distinctive lack of mould for this particular type of bread. So if anyone wants to have a go at that, for science, try baking some bread on Good Friday and let me know if it does actually go mouldy. As I say, I can't bake, otherwise I would try this. But if you hung a hardened Good Friday loaf by the chimney, it would protect the house from fire. And it could also then be grated into water and then that water drunk as a healing remedy, which apparently was a really good cure for diarrhea and other stomach upsets as well. And finally, in terms of healing things, if a woman needing bread rubbed her dough-covered hands on a boy's face, he wouldn't grow a beard. That one kind of feels like it falls into the same category as a lot of weird sayings that people have, usually from a grandparent, they're nearly always from a granddad who said something bizarre when you were a child and you've grown up believing it. So I kind of feel like that falls under that category of weird saying. But I just thought it was extremely specific, for want of a better word. There were a couple of small things about baking practices, but the sort of, again, it's a bit difficult to find where to fit them in the episode. But you had to be careful to break the first bread loaf taken from the oven, not cutting it. Because if you cut the first bread loaf, all the other loaves in that batch would all be heavy. And you should also never sing while you're baking or you'll sour your bread. That one came from an article by Ben Gazer, and I should point out he does have a book on food folklore, which is on the way through Unbound, so hopefully I'll be able to get Ben on at some point when the book comes out, and then he can chat about food folklore with us as well. We are also going to have a special guest this month talking about food, but again, we'll come to that. Back to bread. In centuries past, people might also find echinoid fossils, which is quite a common fossil found around the British Isles, but not understanding what they were. And I guess if you came across one and didn't know, like, you wouldn't be expected to, because they're essentially like the creature that's very similar to a sea urchin. Like, how many people even know what sea urchins look like? But people would come across these as fossils, and they assumed that they were fairy loaves. So if you put one by your oven, it meant that all the bread would bake well. So that's quite a nice one. But then we also come into this really weird category of predictive bread, where people would sort of look at bread and use it to tell omens and so on. So if you broke open your loaf and found a hollow, it was considered a death omen in Lincolnshire, Worcestershire and Yorkshire. And people there even called it a grave, although in Pembrokeshire, it actually predicted a birth for the woman who baked it. And this was also the case for cottage loaves as well. So the baker would knock a dent into the top of the loaf before baking. Again, obviously that idea about how the bread's going to rise. And in some parts, if the dent was still quite deep even after baking, it meant that the baker's wife was pregnant. If a loaf broke in half while it was being cut, it predicted impending death. And in one tale in Cheshire from 1879, a husband went to take the bread from the oven his wife had been baking, and she'd gone out and sort of left him in charge. And one of the loaves had a crack across the top, so he knew something had befallen her. Now, unfortunately, the book doesn't specify what befell her, and I did actually go having a look in British newspaper archives to see if I could find the news article they had referenced, but unfortunately I couldn't, so I have no idea if that particular premonition turned out to be true or not. But this also applied to other baked goods as well. So, for example, if your Christmas pudding broke as you turned it out of the basin, it meant one of the heads of the household would die. If you overturned a loaf of bread in the oven, it meant that there was going to be a death in the house. And in coastal regions, it meant that a ship would be wrecked. And if you turned a loaf upside down, it also meant that you would turn someone out of the house. Now, if you had 4 loaves that ended up getting stuck together in the oven, that meant a wedding would happen. But 5 loaves meant a funeral. And there's also a really peculiar one because bread and butter also ended up with their own predictive abilities. So if you had both bread and butter and cake on your plate at the same time, it heralded a wedding. And if a woman took a second piece of bread and butter, like accidentally, before she'd finished her first, she would soon be married as well. And again, obviously, it's not Fabulous Folklore without love divination these days. So there are actually a couple of things that you can do with bread if you're looking for love. So ladies in Lincolnshire could take communion and then hide the bread in their mouths. They would then go home via a churchyard and spit the hidden bread at a toad. And if the toad ate it, then the man she wanted would be overcome with desire for her. That's really oddly specific as a method. I'm not willing to try that one. So if you want to, please do feel free to let me know if it works. But alternatively, you could make something called cockle bread, which involved climbing onto the table, gathering up your skirt, and then wobbling your bum as if you were kneading dough with your buttocks. You would say, "My dame is sick and gone to bed, and I'll go mould my cockle bread," as you did so. Now, whether this derives from a time in which women really did knead bread with their behind remains to be seen, but I can't help thinking, again, it does rather sound a bit like someone's told someone this for a bit of a laugh and they've taken it seriously. But again, who knows? And there was also a belief that you could make a loaf known as a love cake, and with this one you would rub the dough over your body before you baked it, and the inclusion of your sweat would make them fall for you, apparently. They all sound quite gross and a little bit unhygienic. And the lack of hygiene, sort of in a weird kind of roundabout way, takes us to the link between bread and death. And this is a bit of an odd one because it does take us to sin eating. And the practice of sin eating was apparently very simple, and there is of course a specific episode about it, so I'm not going to go into too much detail because if you're interested you can always listen to the full episode about it. But in practice, mourners would pass the bread over the body of the deceased. Sometimes they would actually place it on the corpse's chest, but either way it was believed to absorb the sins of the deceased, and then by eating it, the sin eater took on that person's sins, and then the dead person could then move on after death. Now, apparently writing in the 1680s, John Aubrey wrote about a remainder of the custom in Oxfordshire, and I quote, where at the burial of every corpse, one cake and one flagon of ale just after the interment were brought to the minister in the church porch, end quote. And Aubrey also noticed the practice in Herefordshire, where mourners would actually hire poor people to take on the sins of the deceased, and they would pass a loaf of bread and a bowl of beer over the corpse after it was brought out of the house. The sin eater would then eat the bread and drink the beer to take on the dead person's sins. And again, that then freed him or her from walking after they were dead, which is quite an important role to play, really. But the reason why it's a bit of an odd one to include is there has been some debate as to whether sin eating was a genuine practice or not. And as I say, that is explored further in the episode, which I will link below. But it was worth putting in, but it's just the idea that no one knows if this was actually something that was actually done or if it was kind of misreported and so on. Although there are some reports of it actually going on well until 1906. So, as I say, it's one of those practices that I think is a little bit difficult to sometimes find in the folklore, but there is also a good historical reason for that. But as I say, if you're interested, you can check out the episode on that. But bread wasn't just used to cleanse the sins of the dead, and it could apparently also be used to find them. And I did debate about putting this one in, purely because of a large news story that we have had in the UK recently, but on the understanding, obviously, most people will have probably listened to this at a different time to when the news story happened. I'm hoping that you realise that I'm including this for the purposes of folklore, not to capitalise on anything. But folklorist William Henderson relates a legend from northern England that claims a way to find bodies discarded in rivers. And you were supposed to take a loaf of bread, make a hollow in the middle, and then place quicksilver, otherwise known as mercury, in it. Remember, mercury is incredibly poisonous. But you would then float the loaf on the water, and mercury would indeed float. It's like a ridiculous metal in terms of its properties. But the loaf was then supposed to head for the body and float above it. There are other versions as well that involve putting candles and things on them, but the quicksilver is the one that I've obviously come across with it being Northern England. And the idea is that the quicksilver could somehow locate the body, and the loaf just kind of sort of becomes like the vessel for it to do that. So what do we make of the folklore of bread? Well, some writers try to link the use of the bread with the sacrament, but I kind of feel like that's a little bit too obvious because, to be fair, people have been baking different forms of bread in different cultures for thousands of years. So to boil everything down to just one thing, I sort of think is a little bit simplistic. And I also can't help thinking that bread appears in so many ways because it's one of the few items which would be common in every household regardless of income. And besides which, nobody would raise an eyebrow at you baking an extra love loaf because baking was so commonplace. It was a regular occurrence. It was something, as I say, that you would do a lot. You go through bread quite quickly because it does have a tendency of going off. So I think that there is a reason why people would use it, because it's just a thing that you have in the pantry. It doesn't require a huge number of ingredients and so on and so forth. Now, its links with healing and protection are slightly harder to fathom, and perhaps its links with Christianity do play a part here. Or again, because of its general ubiquity, maybe that confers special powers on it. Because obviously, after all, hanging a loaf that you baked on Good Friday to guard against fire is a lot more accessible than some of the other remedies. And indeed, if you are interested in how you would protect your home folklore style, I do have an entire guide to that, which you can get by signing up to my email list below. And the link's in the show notes. But ultimately, though, I think a large part of it is, bread is an incredibly versatile ingredient. It goes with so many things. Obviously, it forms quite a large part of most people's diets in some shape or form. So I think it's one of those things that appears in folklore so much because of the fact that it's obviously so easy to include in things, because it would be something that you would already have hanging around the house. And obviously, I dare say there is a religious element to it because of the whole putting a cross on it and doing the baking on Good Friday and so on. But I do think that you kind of maybe have to look a little bit beyond that for the fact that people would have been eating bread well before Christianity came along. But anyway, that is the end of this week's episode. Please do let me know if there are any weird bread superstitions that you follow, if you have any particular bread beliefs or so on that you've come across, or indeed if you had a daft dinner lady that tried to insist that you had to eat your crust and it would make your hair curly. The other one I think I've heard is, it'll give you a hairy chest, which again seems like a really strange way to inspire somebody to eat their crust and also makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But again, why did that become associated with bread crusts? It doesn't make sense. But yeah. But I hope you enjoyed the folklore of bread, and if you do have any toast today, or if you decide to make yourself a sandwich, then, just think twice when you look at that humble sliced loaf and go, do you know what, you're actually quite useful. So I will wish you happy Saturday, and I'll see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.